First thing we'll talk about here is how to word the conclusions for our confidence intervals, making sure that we include all of the important elements, and then we'll end with finding critical z-scores based on confidence levels. So wording conclusions, as we found in that last video, we're going to focus on that 95% confidence interval that we found, which we found was a 0.4604 up to 0.4996. which would translate to a 46.04% to 49.96%. So that's giving us our lower bound and upper bound for the confidence interval. What we're going to go ahead and do in the wording below here is we're going to round that. So we're going to round to 46% to 50% for our wording below. Again, in terms of calculation, you should show all your work and include these values of your confidence interval. But then when you get to the sentence, if you want to round to whole numbers, that would be okay. So all of this was based on a sample proportion of 0.48. So we started with that sample proportion, built the confidence interval, and then we get these range of values. And the idea is that whatever our population proportion is, it should be within that interval with 95% confidence. So, some things that we want to talk about when we make our conclusions. One thing that we're going to mention is our level of confidence. In fact, I usually just start the sentence saying like with 95% confidence or with blah blah percent confidence, and then going from there. Then we need, and the order doesn't matter of these, but we just need to hit these 3 points when we're making our sentences. The range of values, so you want to include the actual interval that we found, which when you state this, since we're only doing confidence intervals with proportions, it'll be something like some lower percent to whatever your upper percent is. And then this is the tricky part of what do those percentages represent? And the idea is that our true population proportion should be between those values. So the proportion that we want to describe here is we want a description of the population proportion. Description of what P would represent. So the idea being, so our original sample, that 0.48, came from 2,500 HR professionals. Then in terms of our description, we'd want to talk about all HR professionals, which is a common word that relates to population. You want to look at everyone. Some things to be careful of here is when you make your description, never mention the sample. So you don't want to mention your sample proportion. That was part of our calculation and it was really important. But in terms of the conclusion, we're trying to make this conclusion that's only about population data. So the conclusion's all about the population. So we don't want to mention anything about our sample proportion or sample size because those are part of the work, but they're not part of the conclusion. So we're going to do here, I know I kind of wrote out the solution in the previous video for this one, but let's just talk about why these sentences don't work and which one does. So this first one says 48% of all HR professionals use social networking sites to research job applicants. So this 48%, that's our sample proportion. That came from the 2,500, and they're trying to say that's true for all HR professionals. So they're basically trying to say the sample proportion that we took is equal to the population proportion, which we do not know that. We don't have that information. You wouldn't know that unless you collected the population data. So we can't just say that that sample proportion is the population proportion. So that sentence does not work. This one basically says the same thing. It takes that 48% and relates it to all. The only thing it adds in now is that it is probably true. So it's trying to get this idea of percent confidence coming through, and this is kind of like over 50% confidence by saying it's probably true. But we still can't do that. We still can't just take that 48% and say that it is the population proportion, even if we're adding this kind of looser wording of it might be true. It's probably true. With Part C, we don't know exactly what proportion of all HR professionals use social networking sites. So now they're saying we don't know what P is, which is true. And then now we're getting a range of values, which is awesome. We want that. So that's hitting Part 2 up above there. But what we want to be careful of is that while they're saying we don't know what our population proportion is, but we know it's between those two values. And that's basically stating 100% confidence. But what we want to be careful of, which I stated at the beginning of that last video, it is possible to take a random sample and have it be an outlier. It's unlikely, but it could happen. And when we randomly sample outliers, that's going to cause the interval to not capture the true population proportion. So we'll never be 100% confident in our interval. So we can't do this. Nope. Does not work. This next one is basically the same sentence, but what they throw in is that it's probably between those two values. And that's getting better, but in terms of our calculation that we did, that's too vague. We can do better than just saying it's probably between there. So that's also a no. This next one is awesome. It hits all of the pieces. It says we are 95% confident. So now it's saying how sure we are. So instead of saying we know, which would mean 100% confidence, or it's probably, which just kind of means like over 50%, we're 95% confident. And then between those two values, which is awesome. And then this is where we see our wording for the population proportion. All HR professionals use social networking sites to research job applicants. So this is what we want. That's perfect. So that's the type of sentence that we want to make. You can see they don't mention the 48% anywhere in there, and that's because that's our sample proportion. So that's done with. It also doesn't mention the 2,500 people that we surveyed because we were done with that. It just relates confidence level, the interval that we found, to a description of our population proportion. With the wording of the questions that we look at, they'll often give you a structure for how to phrase your true population proportion. So we'll look at some examples with that.